Greetings chess friends, Robbie here, and I'm going to do another series of little lectures on square strategy theory, but we're going to strip it right down to the very basics. We're going to look at what makes a particular colour complex weak. We're going to look at how we can employ our pieces against that particular complex and formulate successful strategies. Now if you look at this position here, we can see that we have a very strong bishop here on e5. Controls this diagonal here, controls this diagonal here. So it's fair to say that we have a d4 area within our own camp that we should be seeking to defend. But what about our opponent? Well, we can see that the g7 square is very weak. It's defended only by the king. We can see that there is an absence of a dark square bishop. Therefore, it's fairly safe to say that he might be weak on the dark squares. Therefore, we should examine the e5 colour complex. And when we do that, we can see that an absence of pawns guard these squares. And therefore we can easily infiltrate it. So we have these three elements here. We have a square that is controlled only by the king, a very weak square, the g7 square. We have the absence of a dark square bishop to oppose our dark square bishop. And there is the absence of pawns to control this colour complex. So according to square strategy theory then, we have a d4 strategy in the direction of, e5, and we should be attacking the dark squares. So having done so, we now try to look at candidate moves to help us do that. And of course in this position it's a very mundane and fundamental reason to see that we can simply deliver mate on the weakened square g7. Now, I show this very basic example simply because we're going to build upon it, and it serves us really well to think of colour complexes in their most simplest form. So we're going to look at this position a little further and with a little twist to it. Now here we have a similar position, and instead of trying to trade queens with queen g5, Black tried to grab a pawn on f2, thinking that the g7 square was in fact covered. Now, why does this move f2 fail? Well, simply put, when the knight was on e4, it was blockading this light squared bishop, and when it grabbed the pawn on f2, it released this bishop. Now, even though we can see that the colour complex that we are attacking is dark squared, we apply the square strategy theory principle of occupying the squares of one colour, in this case dark squares, and attacking those of the opposite colour. Now, if you do that, you will readily find that you could make the bishop sacrifice. Bishop takes g6. Opening important files and diagonals against the enemy king. Pawn takes, queen takes, again aiming at the dark squared weakness, interposes, and again we mate on g7, taking advantage of the occupation of this dark squared colour complex. Now, I thought this example was particularly interesting because it demonstrated that even though we were attacking the dark squares, it was important for us to also remember that we are occupying the squares of one colour and we are attacking the squares of the opposite colour, in this case these light squares. So this little example highlighted that aspect. It's always important to remember that when we're going for a kingside attack, we're essentially trying to open files and diagonals for our pieces, and in this instance of course we did that with the bishop sacrifice on g6. So again, we'll build on this little lesson, and as we progress, the lessons will become more and more complicated. Okay, we have another similar position, and again we can see we have a very strong d4 area in our own camp that we are seeking to defend. If we look at our opponent's camp and pieces, we can see that there is no dark square bishop to oppose our dark square bishop. We can see that there is a very weak square on g7, also a dark square, and we can see that there is no pawns which can defend these squares. So it's very easy for us to formulate the idea. It's a d4 strategy in the direction of e5, dark squares. We then need to think about candidate moves and how we can exploit this weakness. And of course the first move that springs to mind is queen d2, planning to bring the queen up to h6, where it will influence these squares. But we need to be careful because black is not without resources. And if I could just, this was the initial position. Black actually played, after we played queen d2, black played this move, queen d7, with a purpose. And the purpose was that if we immediately move our queen up here to h6, black will simply play knight f5, taking control of these dark squares. So we need to think about that when we're thinking about variations. Now, that being the case, what move do you think that we should try to employ in order to best take advantage of the dark squares? If you'd like to pause the video for a moment, you can do so. Okay, the actual move that was played was the brilliant g4. And of course the idea is that it keeps a knight out of f5, because if that knight ever reached f5, it would influence the colour complex that we are trying to infiltrate. Black played some move, and of course now we can bring our queen up, but it influences this dark square colour complex. Black had no better move than this, and of course it's too late for him, and we crash in here on this weak dark square colour complex, culminating our successful strategy, d4 strategy, in the direction of e5, black squares. So I like this little example because the move g4 was not immediately, what we could say, obvious, but we need to remember that we are trying to influence the entire colour complex, and the move g4 of course did that for us. So it's good to keep little moves like that in mind. I'll look at it, go on, and we'll look at more complicated examples after this. Okay, here we have another position quite similar, and hopefully by now you can see or determine where there are weaknesses in black's camp, and of course again it's in the dark squares. Now what led us to this conclusion? Well, it's fairly easy to see that black does not have a dark squared bishop. We do. There are no pawns defending this particular colour complex. The queen is hemmed in on this diagonal. It has a lack of mobility. There is no knight to defend the squares either. Therefore we can see that the colour complex d4, the direction of e5, dark squares, is particularly weak. And all we need to try to do is exploit this weakness. And we consider candidate moves which would help us to do that. Of course, the first one that comes to mind is bishop g5, exploiting the lack of mobility and the lack of cover for this colour complex. Black has no better move than to try to stave off this. Of course, we simply play bishop takes f6 with a winning position already, simply exploiting this colour complex. Now that was of course a fairly easy example, but I cite it once again simply to demonstrate that we need to get these ideas into our mind, what helps us to realise why a particular complex is weak. So we'll look at another position now. Now here is another interesting position and we're going to try to see how we can exploit the positional and pawn weaknesses in our opponent's camp. And we can see, looking at the position, that there is once again an absence of a dark square bishop to oppose ours. So again we look at the weaknesses in the e5 colour complex. We can see that this is undefended. This is defended only by the queen. Of course, the queen itself is undefended. We can see that this square cannot be defended by a pawn, and we can see that the colour complex therefore is fairly weak, and we could exploit that. And the move that we do, of course, is bishop b4, taking advantage of the lack of the dark square bishop and this open diagonal against the black king. Black here played knight to d7. Of course, he could have taken on c4, but we simply dominate the colour complex, the dark squares, against the enemy king. Instead, played knight d7. I should have, of course, mentioned that the strategy is, of course, an e4 strategy because of the pawn here on c4 and the bishop here on g2. However, the dark squares that we are seeking to influence are these dark squares, as we have said, on the queen side. It is therefore an e4 strategy, the direction of d5, dark squares. Sorry for failing to mention that at the outset. Now, can you think of a move here that would take advantage of this dark square colour complex? Of course, the move bishop d6 springs to mind, aiming at the queen and completely dominating this dark square colour complex on the queen side. White has no other choice except to try to take the open file, but of course we can move our rook to c1, where it once again not only takes the open c file but targets itself against this weak colour complex on the queen side. Black tries to initiate a queen trade, and it's of little consequence to us, of course, because the queen here is Black's most active piece. However, we are planning on dominating this colour complex here, and we therefore occupy it with the move rook c7, taking the 7th rank and occupying this dark squared colour complex. e4 strategy in the direction of d5, dark squares. Queen takes, rook takes, and pawn f6. And again, the lesson could end here because, as we can see, black's pieces are all paralysed, but just for the sake of consistency, we'll carry it on. And we can see that we apply the principle of occupying the squares of one colour and attacking those of the opposite colour. And we can do that in this instance, the move bishop takes b7, attacking the squares of the opposite colour. Of course, black is nothing better than bishop takes, rook takes, rook to f8, and bishop to a3, and we have a completely winning position. All because we were able to dominate and occupy this dark square colour complex, and of course attack the pieces that were defending the opposite colour. Employing an e4 strategy, the direction of d5, dark squares. So once again we have a position, and hopefully by now you are able to determine what constitutes a weak colour complex. Again, in this instance we can see it is the dark squares on the king side. Absence of pawns to guard these squares, a dark square bishop that is out of sorts, all lead us to believe that yes indeed, this particular colour complex is weak. And of course, as usual, we think of moves that we can utilise in order to exploit this particular weakness. And of course, we can see that the move bishop h6 does just that, influencing these three important squares of this particular complex. Chasing the rook away to e8. Now again, thinking of the particular colour complex, can you think of a move that we might employ in order to influence this either directly or indirectly? And one of the moves that we should have thought of course, is a3, seeking to exchange the dark square bishop, leaving our bishop with dominance on these dark squares. So certainly a move a3 is something that we should consider. Black takes, and we take. And now we have an unopposed dark square bishop influencing this colour complex. Black plays the move knight d7, hoping to shore up these dark squares. Now, looking at this position, can you think of a move that you could utilise in order to combat this plan? What about the move bishop b5, seeking to pin this knight, which has dared to try to have some influence over this dark square colour complex? Well, that would certainly be a move that we would wish to consider. Pinning the knight, and of course stopping black playing the freeing move f6. Black tries to challenge the bishop, but of course it has no effect because we simply exchange it off. White takes the bishop off, and here we castle because we're simply, why can't I castle? It's weird. Because we simply want to avoid counterplay if white tries to bring his bishop here to b5. So we simply castle to get that out of the way. Oops. Queen c7, and here we transfer our queen where it eyes the dark square colour complex. Pawn takes d4, pawn takes d4. Black is trying to drum up counterplay along the open c file. Rook c8, we of course defend this. Here black tries to exchange queens. Of course we have no desire to exchange queens because we have a weak colour complex here that we are seeking to influence. We therefore simply play queen to f4, getting out of the way of any queen exchange. Here black plays knight f5, trying to shore up the dark squares, attacking our bishop here which controls these dark squares. Of course we simply get out of the way of that. And here black plays a very interesting move, rook to c4, really trying to drum up play against our d4 area. And this is a great example of why we need essentially to control our own area within our camp, because when we are trying to take possession of a complex like this, of course our opponent is simply not going to let us do it. We therefore need some stability in our own camp, and protecting our own area, in this case the d4 area, helps us to stave off this type of counterplay. Of course the move we play is simply rook to d1, shoring up the d4 area. Here black plays the interesting move h5, of course stopping us putting our knight here to h4, but we might use it to crash through on these squares. And of course stopping us from playing the move that we would love to play, g4, kicking this knight away here, which defends the colour complex that we are trying to influence. Oops. And here we of course aim our bishop at the colour complex. Black here tried to drum up again counterplay against this pawn here on c2, and here we have an excellent move. It's always good to remember that when we are attacking against the king in a king attack, that we want to open up files and diagonals against the king. Of course the move that black tried to prevent by playing h5, we play it anyway, g4. Pawn takes, queen takes. Here we can see we've opened up the h file and all these juicy dark squares here. And of course what would you play here? Of course we have the rather excellent queen to h3, threatening to invade on the dark squares and threatening checkmate in one. Black plays some tricky move, trying to block the diagonal with knight to g7. Of course, keep in mind our idea to occupy these dark squares, and we simply play queen to h6, once again threatening mate. And here the queen came back, trying to shore up the g7 square. Think about a colour complex. We're seeking to occupy the squares of one colour and attack those of another colour. And of course what move would spring to mind is of course knight to g5, threatening checkmate in one. So that was just a little bit more complicated. We saw how that we needed to be patient in order to get our pieces into good positions within the complex that we're seeking to infiltrate. We saw the importance of defending our own area against counterplay, because in many times when there is a weak colour complex, the only thing our opponent can do is hope to drum up counterplay in other areas of the board. So that is why we really needed to defend the area within our own camp with such vigilance. So I'm going to stop there. Hopefully you have enjoyed these little lessons, and there are many more to come, and as we go on they will gradually get more complicated and more complicated. But thank you again, once again, very much for your time, and I'll leave you for now. So take care. Bye bye.